All right. So it's 1:31 here on the East Coast, and I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Um, we are recording. I'm Romy Newman, and I'm so honored to welcome our guest, Jennifer Tardy. Jennifer, thank you for being here. You want to tell us about yourself for a minute?
Absolutely. So I'm Jen Tardy. I am the owner of Jennifer Tardy Consulting, and I share with people often that we live in two different spaces within our consulting business. On one end, we offer career coaching to people on their job search, and more specifically, we help job seekers to navigate the bias that is hidden in the hiring process. And then on the other end, we work with employers. Where we offer training to recruiters and to hiring managers to help them to identify the bias and get ahead of it so they can dismantle it. So it's a lot of work to do, but we love doing this work.
Amazing. And I've already told this to Jennifer, but you are a true celebrity, Jen, because we've never in Fairy God Boss history had so many people register for the webinar. We already have over 600 people dialed in here today. So welcome all of you, and thanks for joining us. I'm going to start, before we do a Q&A with Jen, I'm going to just quickly start by sharing some research we recently fielded, and this is really hot off the presses, but we did a survey, we did a survey of the employer brand and talent acquisition and diversity communities, professional communities, to understand priorities and where everyone is setting goals in terms of diversity recruiting in 2021. So before we even get to that, I think it's so important to talk about the overarching landscape. I don't know if any of you are also in the New York area, but you may have noticed this weekend in the New York Times, there was an entire print section devoted to the topic that America's mothers are in crisis, devoted to this enormous exodus we've seen from the US workforce. This headline says nearly 2.2 million women left the workforce between February and October. In December, and I think the end tally is over 3 million. In December, 140,000 jobs were lost in the US economy. All of them were lost by women, and all of them were lost by women of color. In fact, men and white women actually gained. And so, we're seeing a true moment of crisis for women in the workplace. I also heard on the radio this morning, still half of American school children are not in school, right? So this enormous caregiving entity that we were all dependent upon is just, the infrastructure has broken apart. So we are in a moment of true crisis. And the crisis, as I mentioned, is it's bad for women overall, and it's exceptionally bad for women of color. For Black working women, we see an enormously heavy burden. We see Black women and Latina women with higher unemployment than women overall. We also see Black women and Latina women indexing higher in terms of having been personally impacted by the death of a loved one from COVID. So this crisis is happening much worse for women of color than even it is for women overall. And so I mentioned the survey that we conducted. So as we pull in this research that we were able to collect from about 200 talent acquisition, employer brand, and diversity professionals, 98% of them said diversity recruiting is an organizational focus this year. And we didn't conduct this survey last year. I wish we had, because I can guarantee you that number has increased. However, 54% say they have tangible, specific goals. So a focus rather than something they're putting specific metrics against. Now, I still would say this 54% is a dramatic increase from past years. When we look at what functions are most important, technology by far, sales, non-technology engineering, finance, marketing. And by the way, we will share all this data with all of you following the webinar. So just under half of respondents said that their organization had a chief diversity officer or specific head of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And when we look at kind of the resources they're allocating with their diversity hiring efforts, number one was unconscious bias training, which Jen is a phenomenal resource for. The next highest was there's been significant investments in gender neutral job descriptions. A smaller portion have done compensation audits, interview audits. About a quarter now have staff members that are specifically tapped with diversity recruiting, diversity employee referral programs, and then further down, publishing compensation ranges and resume blinding. Throughout the hiring funnel, just about 60% of respondents said that they captured the demographics or diversity data about hires. Just over half captured it on applications, and then less than half capturing that data on internal transfers and promotions, candidate screening. In terms of employer brand, about 65% of respondents said they had an employer branding function in their organization. And as part of the employer branding efforts, just over half said that their company had published a public statement about the company's commitment to diversity. Exactly half had dedicated space to the company's diversity commitments on their career site. And also about half were promoting their employee resource groups as part of their employer branding efforts. 44% were using a targeted platform, and 27% were publishing flexible work policies. And from another study we've done of women in the workplace, I thought it was just interesting to kind of communicate that we saw that women were 1.5 times more likely to make a decision about where they're working based on how their employer, the stance their employer had taken on gender and racial equality. And Black women were twice as likely. So really, really important for companies trying to recruit those populations to be very vocal about their stance on diversity publicly. We talked about these terrible jobs numbers at the outset, and we saw recently a study that came from Zurich in the UK, Zurich, the insurance provider. They ran a test. They added 6 words to their job listings that were flexibility, remote work, and as a result, they saw an increase of 20% in women applying for their senior level roles just by adding those words to the job descriptions. And yet we are only seeing that 26% of respondents are publishing or even communicating whether they have a flexible working policy. One of the key contributors to successful diversity in hiring is diverse slates. And you may be familiar, I'm sure you are, Jennifer, with this data out of Harvard Business Review that shows that if you want to drive diversity hiring, you need to have equal representation of diversity on your slate. I think a lot of companies, I'll hear that, yes, we're trying to have diverse slates. What we'll do is add one candidate from a historically underrepresented minority to the slate. And that one will never work. That one will automatically be eliminated. So really what you need is adequate representation on your slate itself. Only 24% of the organizations we surveyed said that they currently have diversity requirements on their candidate slates. We also asked, does your organization have diverse hiring panels, meaning do the people who are doing the interviewing, do they reflect the diversity of the organization? And just about half said that they are cognizant of this, they're tracking for this. So about 24% of respondents said that their current tool, LinkedIn, was working, 22% said employee referrals were working, and 22% said talent networks were working. But our research shows pretty consistently that women have almost essentially half as much success finding a job on LinkedIn. And 40% of women found their job through personal connections. So really amplifying the efforts through those talent networks and employee referrals is important. I want to take a minute on the LinkedIn thing because I think LinkedIn is a phenomenal tool. I love it. But I think, what's happening is that our offline bias is transferring onto the LinkedIn platform. And what we see is that candidates that don't self-promote as well don't get noticed, they don't surface in results on LinkedIn, and as a result, they're less likely to be contacted by recruiters and less likely to get jobs. And we know that on average, women are significantly less likely to promote. So that sort of the resume bias we've known about for 30 years is just moving online. And at Fairy Godboss, it's our core hypothesis that diverse job seekers behave differently. We see that among women, as I mentioned with LinkedIn, the existing set of tools aren't satisfying their needs. They're also just not nearly as aggressive about applying for jobs. We know there's a confidence gap and women need to meet many more qualifications before applying. And lastly, we see that women job seekers, much like in that Zurich example, they're evaluating the jobs based on different criteria. They're not interested in whether there's a foosball table or a free gym membership. They want to know, how does the company promote women or other underrepresented minorities? They want to know, how does the company think about having role models, think about ERGs, think about diversity in general. And so to close and get to the part that everyone is waiting for, where we talk to Jen, I think as we look ahead, we see that the platforms that have traditionally existed for job seekers, the one-size-fits-all approach is not helping improve the diversity of the candidate pools. And so what we see moving forward is more targeted strategies that will help companies attract the diverse candidates they're looking for. And that's what Fairy Godboss is designed to do for women and diverse women. So with that, I'm going to start a Q&A with Jen, and then I see lots of participation already, and I think we will get to having time at the end for all of you to ask Jen your questions as well.
May I say something before we jump in?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I love that we started this whole conversation off based on data. And even if we're looking back at all of the previous slides, like, this is the world that I live in. I mean, so you're showing the data behind what I see when I'm talking to clients, those who are on their job search, and what I see when I'm talking to hiring managers and recruiters as well too. It is, this data is real. So, anyone watching this that's like, oh, I don't know. No, this is real. And so I'm glad that we're talking about it. I was like, I can't wait to talk about this.
Me too. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my slides because I want to make sure everyone gets to see you. So, so a lot of the people who've joined this call are joining because they're just starting this journey. They're trying to figure out how to implement a diversity recruiting strategy. So what would you say, if you're at the beginning of this journey, what's the first thing to think about?
So one of the first things that I share with organizations is who's in support of it, right? So it's awesome that that you as an individual are saying, we need to increase representation here at this organization. But unless you have the decision makers, the senior leadership team in support of it, then it is going to be an uphill battle. And so if you're looking for a place to start, it's starting with the business case among the senior leadership team. And even when people are coming to me and they're saying, hey, we are ready to implement something around diversity recruiting. And I'll say, well, do not allow recruiting to be the initiators of increasing representation, because then you're still missing the point. Diversity recruiting is only a small piece of why it's important to have increased diversity and inclusion and belonging within your organization. Diversity recruiting needs to come under a larger umbrella of D&I in general. So yeah, we want to start somewhere. Who's in support of it?
And I think that goes to the initial kind of data point about, do you have real metrics? Because if you want to if you really want to achieve progress, it's not enough to say we'd like to be more diverse. We have to have set specific goals, like with any initiative.
Yeah. But I would also add one other piece to that as well too, to connect with what you're saying around metrics. The second thing that I will point out as well is it's important to understand your starting line, right? Where
Yes.
are you starting? So many
Yes.
organizations are jumping out there and saying, hey, we stand with increasing diversity within our organization. And so recruiters, start recruiting, help us to increase diversity. They have no clue where you're underrepresented. They have no clue what full representation looks like. They have no clue at how long they have to reach it. And so I would say you have to understand your starting line and get very specific on where you are as a company.
For sure, for sure. So as I mentioned, we have observed that women job seekers behave differently in the process, and you mentioned you see that as well. What are you seeing in terms of differences of women and men in the job markets, and what can companies do a better job of to attract more women?
Yeah, so maybe three areas that I see when I'm working with clients who are women. One is around asking for what they want. Okay, so um, and this could be um, as small as saying, in my next work environment, I want the work environment to include X, Y, and Z. And so, number one, we're not thinking about it. Number two, we're not asking the right questions to see if the company actually offers that, right? Because we're thinking that if we go into this interview, it's not acceptable for me to ask those questions. That's one piece. The second piece, which is one that I see quite often, is the area around confidence. It's one thing to feel confident, right? But it's another thing to project confidence when you're interviewing with an employer. And so when I'm talking to my female clients and we're talking about confidence, I'll say to them that I know that you know your track record. I know that you know that you've been successful, but you've got to articulate that to the employer. I know that you feel confident that you can get this job done, but even at minimum, I need you to say, I feel confident that I can get this job done. And then it kind of funnels into that last piece, which is selling themselves. I've heard a lot of my clients say, it just feels like being a sleazy salesperson selling yourself. And I'm like, no, if you don't speak to the facts of your work experience, which is all that is, if you don't do it, the interviewer cannot go into your head and find all of that, historical information and then say, okay, I trust that this person can do the job. One other piece as a bonus to that other piece as well is oftentimes, and this affects people of color quite often. So you think about the intersectionality of women and people of color, that we've done so much in the past that we've not celebrated those milestones. And if we don't celebrate those milestones in any way, then we tend to forget that we've done so much. And so now when it's time to sell ourselves, we can't recall what we've already done because we've never really marked it as a milestone. And we don't see it as doing something, great. We see it as a standard for ourselves. So yeah.
So keep a list of your accomplishments, an accomplishment journal.
Exactly. And I love that. An accomplishment journal would be great.
Yeah. That's a really great point. And actually, it's interesting. My co-founder and I, as part of kind of our social mission, we're doing a job seeker boot camp with 6 women who lost their jobs in COVID. And the number one thing I'm seeing is just such challenge with confidence. They really have a hard time asserting. These women have incredible resumes, and they're having a hard time asserting all of the amazing accomplishments that are, as you point out, just facts. They're just facts.
But that's a really, really big deal, because if you can't see for yourself how accomplished you are, that's going to show up in your resume, and it's going to show up when you're answering questions to the interviewer. Sometimes we'll redo a resume and we'll show the client that resume and we'll say, do you know who this person is? And they're like, whoa, that's me. Yes, this is what I see. Why don't you see that? Why don't you see this person? That becomes a big deal.
Right. Absolutely. So it's Black History Month, and we have more conversation, I think, about racial diversity in America than we've ever had. But yet we still see, as the data showed, that Black women are really disproportionately struggling in this COVID economy. And I talked to a lot of companies that are specifically trying to hire more Black women. What would you recommend that they do to reach and attract more Black women to their companies?
So this is going to, that's a great question, by the way. And the way that I always start with answering this question is I would encourage, let's say I'm talking to a hiring manager who says, we want to increase representation among Black women on our team. Jen, what can we do? I'll say the first conversation that I want you to have at your next team meeting is for your team to think about how many Black women are in their personal network. I just want us to sit with that for a second. When we think about who's in our personal networks and how many of those individuals identify as a Black woman, you'll begin to see where the problem starts. It starts in our homes and in our personal decisions.
Absolutely.
Because then one of the things that you have pointed out before is people, and I think it was women that you mentioned, who are finding these jobs, are finding it through networks. And then as you begin thinking about, which confirms the whole hidden job market, which is a big deal, that, that, I don't know, it was like 70% of jobs are on the hidden or within this hidden job market, meaning they don't really get posted. You find it through people that you're networking with. And then on top of that, I think LinkedIn talks about this whole concept of this network gap. And so when I say that it starts within our personal networks, increase diversity there first among Black women, and then that's going to help to shape who gets access to this hidden job market, who gets access to being a referral to get into jobs. So, and that's just one place. And I love talking about that. And then the other place is, I'm a huge fan of going where they are. Because one of the other slides that you pointed out, you said a lot of people will go to Indeed, LinkedIn, and if you think about those populations and which groups are overrepresented there, if you truly want to increase diversity among Black women, then go to job boards and networking events that are overrepresented for Black women. And what I'm finding too is that so many Black women have been have either felt lost in a sea of overrepresentation, specifically among white job seekers, and excluded from personal networks, that they are now forming their own networks. And so it's not that hard to find those those other organizations, those other events where it's for Black women. One other thing that I will point out as well too, if you're looking to increase diversity among Black women, and this can be a little controversial, but it's still very important. Within your employee community, within your employees, within your workplace, the Black women who are there, it's important that they have a platform to tell their own stories of what their experiences are of working at that company. And the reason why it can be controversial is because if an organization does this incorrectly, it can lead to people feeling like tokens to do this work. But if you have, the right people that are leading this initiative saying, we recognize that we are underrepresented, we want to be well represented among Black women within this organization, and we know that that one of the spaces, one of the many things that we're doing is we're creating a platform for more Black women to tell their stories about what it's like working here in their positions, and then invite people to volunteer to do it or incentivize them to do it along the way. So those are just some examples.
Yeah, I mean, we see that across the board. Companies need to provide more authentic testimonials from their underrepresented populations. That's what people are looking for. Does someone like me have success at this kind of company? Does someone like me, are they happy at this company?
And this can even be industry-wide too, because there are industries, and I know that I'm going to butcher this area, this industry, but I think it's like like oceanographers or like oceanography sciences or something. Just go with me on it, right? And there has not been one time that I can think of in my whole life where I've thought, I need to be an oceanographer, right? But I happened to talk to some people working in that industry, and I was like, oh, this is an awesome career. This is an awesome path. But if I've never been exposed to it, and if I've never seen people who look like me in that industry, then it's never going to connect to me or my kids or their kids that they need to be thinking about an area like that. So I think it could benefit industries that kind of fit this to come together, employers within those industries to do some sort of campaign like See Yourself Here campaign. I wouldn't just say See Yourself Here, Black people, but but a See Yourself Here type of campaign so that more people can start seeing their place in industries that are very underrepresented.
Yeah, that's great. And now we'll know if you disappear and go become an oceanographer, we'll know why.
Right. Sounds pretty cool to me.
If the next time we do this, you're on a submarine.
Right.
Okay, you alluded to this earlier, but I think this is one of the most interesting things that you talk about, which is recruiters. Having recruiters' energy behind this is so important, but they're not the decision maker. The hiring managers are.
Correct.
How can recruiters improve relationships and coordination with hiring managers?
I think the very first thing that has to happen is that recruiters and hiring managers have to understand that they are a team, both accountable for increasing diversity in the organization. They may not be the only folks accountable, but they are truly on the front lines of helping to increase diversity. And then the next thing that has to be discussed is, on this team, who's accountable for what? And as a general rule, I always share with recruiters, you are accountable for the diversity within the candidate pool to ensure that there's diversity among that candidate pool. And because typically recruiters aren't making the final selection decision, there becomes this whole area of accountability for hiring managers on who gets hired and the level of diversity there. And so that's the first conversation on, we are a team, but here's who's accountable for what. And then I think the next piece is ensuring that hiring managers know that they can partner with recruiters as a resource on things that they need to know more about, because recruiters are supposed to be the experts in recruiting and everything related to recruiting, such as increasing diversity. And then I think another piece of that as well too, and this is a really important piece, and I also place this into the hands of recruiters as well. Because of the access that we have, and I say we because I'm a recruiter at heart, I've been in this role for 15 years, because of the access that we have to the hiring process, there will be things that we see only. And that if we don't lean in to those things that we see, if we turn our heads to it, nobody else is going to see it and nobody else is going to fix it. So recruiters are caught in this space of being easy to do business with. And you probably get that, right?
Customer satisfaction, right.
So how do you empower recruiters to be easy to do business with and at the same time lean in to disrupt bias where they need to do that? It is a difficult thing to say to a recruiter that this is your hiring manager, especially if there's several levels above you, being able to say, hey, I noticed that that of the last 7 people who came into interview, only 2 people passed your interview and they happen to be white men, right? And the other 5 who didn't pass, they were people of color. That is a hard conversation to have. And so, I'm about to go on a rabbit hole, but I won't. But so so a big part of that is making sure that your recruiters feel empowered to lean in. They feel qualified to say, I think we may have an issue here. Let's talk a little bit about it, so that they can be stronger partners to hiring managers, and vice versa. Hiring managers be stronger partners to recruiters as well.
Absolutely. And again, it comes from the top, right? Because if the incentives, if the organization is rewarding the hiring managers that drive the most diversity, this is a no-brainer, right? If the recruiter then can help the hiring manager be a hero, right, by driving diversity, and you see that a little bit. I use the example of Microsoft, where one of the ways that managers are evaluated at the end of the year in their performance review is based on the diversity of their team.
If employers want a quick win on increasing diversity at their company, tie it to the leaders' performance bonuses, tie it to their performance overall. And I promise you, but it's not just increasing diversity, it's any changes that you want to see.
Of course.
Your performance reviews are where you formally hold people accountable for what you expect. And if an organization is saying, we expect this to happen, then why isn't it tied to a performance review overall or a bonus?
Absolutely, 100%. So what are the case studies of the most successful companies? What do they do in addition to incentives to to succeed in diversity recruiting?
One of the main things that I see is that they equip their people on the front line, their hiring teams, with training. And if you've ever seen any of my YouTube videos for recruiters, I joke a little bit, and I am joking when I say, I teach you everything you need to know except those ridiculous Boolean string searches. And I only say Boolean string searches are actually pretty cool to know how to do. It's really important, right? My frustration has been that when I see trainings out there and they say that we will get you certified to be a diversity recruiter, but 80% of it teaches you how to do sophisticated Boolean string searches, I'm like, this isn't it. And so, which is why we created our own training. But the type of training that I'm talking about that those on the front line need are training around language to use, right? And so whenever I see, this is just an example, I could be in a meeting and I could hear someone say they're not sure whether to say Black or African American, and they stutter through it. And now they're uncomfortable and everybody's uncomfortable. And now it's just a whole uncomfortable conversation. Or if someone doesn't know whether to say Latino, Latina, or Latinx, or if they don't know, and you and I were talking about this earlier, but the whole idea of diversity is not in a person. Diversity is not because of me, it's because of us. Diversity is because, it's because of a group, not because of a person. But having the right language to use, that is a foundational reason why people on the front lines aren't fully engaged in this. They're afraid to say the wrong things. They're afraid to look the wrong way. They're afraid to say something that could be offensive, and then they get fired from the organization. Can you imagine what that must feel like? And that's why I understand why so many people, and I'm again talking about recruiters and hiring managers, haven't been leaning all the way in. They haven't had the training. They also haven't had the training around understanding how we got here. This whole idea of increasing diversity didn't just pop out of the sky. And I share with people often that the hiring process, as it was created centuries ago, is doing exactly what it was created to do. It was created so that men who were white were able to get the most powerful positions. And at the cost of people who didn't fit that bill, to keep them behind, to disenfranchise them disproportionately. And so even though over centuries we've had, civil rights laws enacted that have moved the dial, there's still a lot of work to do, and those things that were once overt are now covert. And those things that were once just completely obvious are now, maybe unconscious. But it's that training that helps you to uncover those areas so that you're able to see it when you're recruiting. So recruiters know how to recruit. They just don't know, they don't understand the the concept of diversity and inclusion in context to recruiting. And I think that's a proper training.
Absolutely. Great perspective. So my next question for you is, sometimes we'll talk to individuals at companies who say, I'm passionate about making our company more diverse, but I haven't gotten buy-in from the executive level or the hiring managers yet. If you want to be a champion for diversity, what do you recommend? How can we fight the good fight and advocate to drive diversity throughout the organization?
Yeah, yes, and it's so interesting. This is probably the second or third time I think this week that question has come up, and the only reason why I remember it is because I want to give a great answer, but it's a tough question because if the organization doesn't have an appetite for it, you can tell through their actions, regardless of what their words say. If there's no appetite for it, then all of your efforts will feel futile. It will feel like an uphill battle, right? But if you say, I still want to stay and I still want to try to do something, I would say ask more questions. As a matter of fact, this is the whole idea of calling people in versus calling people out. I make up stuff all the time. This is one of those things that I made up, right? So a lot of people believe that the approach is, employer or leaders, I'm going to call you out on everything that you do wrong. I'm going to call you on this, and this, right? And it can be effective for some people in some environments. However, sometimes your message can get lost in all of the and all of what happens because a person is called out, that guilt and all of that stuff. Instead, calling a person in or calling leaders in means asking more questions, right? And so if we were to assume positive intent, what questions will we ask? One of the questions that I would ask is, do we collect data here? Do we collect data around the hiring process and who gets promotions here? And then if we collect data, do we analyze that data? For some listening to this, you may think, duh, if you're collecting data, you would analyze that data, but you would not believe the number of organizations that collect data and don't analyze it. Let me actually take one quick step back. You would not believe the number of organizations that don't collect data. And I think that you had that in your PowerPoint slides earlier.
And by the way, that's partly because it's really much harder to collect than you would initially think.
Correct. And so however, there are many organizations that, and when I'm talking about data, I'm talking about self-identification data. So when an employee, when a person, a job seeker is applying for a position, they can voluntarily answer questions about their race, ethnicity, gender. Some do veteran status, some do, ability status, things of that nature. And so many organizations won't even collect that data because to collect that data, some organizations would rather just, not know. And if you don't know, you can't be held accountable, right? Okay, so now, so are we collecting data? And if we are we analyzing that data? And if we're analyzing that data, what are we doing to process and improve based on what we see in that data? And so asking those types of questions, can we collect data? Can we analyze? Can we do something with it? I think that helps more with getting the ball moving forward. And if they say we don't, why not?
Right. And I actually want to turn to some of the questions, and I'm going to kind of pivot to questions from the audience. Just so you know, we had more than 900 people turn up for this. So, but I want to take some of the questions. But the first one I want to take, because it's been coming up a lot in my conversations, and I think I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. People are asking, is it legal to collect this data? And then how do you view this? We never would want to connect this data to the individual, right? We look at it in the aggregate. So what's legal? How do you recommend doing that without connecting it to an individual?
Got it. So one of the first things that I have to say, because my labor law attorney tells me to say this every time, is that I'm not an attorney.
But you play one on TV? No.
Right. But one of the things that I have to do in my business is I work very closely to a labor law attorney, because when I was also leading recruitment teams, we were told lots of things. We shouldn't collect data. We shouldn't. Recruiters should have no access to that data. All of those things. And so I'm now trying to get to the bottom of a lot of this and, where is it coming from? So just know that all organizations are different and they can make their own decisions on levels of risk that they're willing to take. Because if you collect data and and it's found to have adverse impact within it, then the organization could be held liable for it. Okay, so let me just say that. So it is legal to collect data, and it's self-ID data that I'm referring to, which is what I spoke about before.
And this is based on EEOC or other questions that are part of a job application.
Correct. Now, it needs to be voluntary. So you can make the question mandatory, but meaning they have to answer the question, but there needs to be an opt-out piece to it. So if people don't want to put that information in, they have the right to.
I prefer not to say.
Correct. I prefer not to say. Now, when this data is collected in organizations, many of them will say, well, we want to make sure that recruiters and anybody that's connected to the recruiting process, that they have no access to this data. And the reason why many organizations say that is because if in any way it can be found that a decision has been made related to any of those protected categories, then your company could be potentially liable for discrimination or something like that. So that's why companies have said, let's keep it far away. But that's not necessarily the case. What you want to keep it separate from is the person making the hiring decision. If anyone, if you keep it away from anyone, keep it away from the person making that selection decision. There's no business reason for the hiring manager to know how people identify in that candidate pool. There's so much to this, but I'm gonna, keep going with it. But there is a business reason for recruiters to understand how the level of diversity within their candidate pools. How on earth am I going to know if we have full or a good level of representation in the candidate pool if I'm not able to see this collectively? But there is no business reason for me to know one specific person's how they identify. Does all of that make sense?
Absolutely. That was very helpful. Thank you. We also had another question that's one that I get a lot. I got to scroll a minute here to get to it. But in short, for a lot of recruiters, they're measured on cost per hire. They're measured on, time to fill. I'm gonna find the right. I can't find it. So cost to hire, time to fill, and not necessarily diversity. And especially that we're remote. If you have to slow down the hiring process to allow for a diverse slate or a diverse pool, it feels like it's not what the company is looking for. What do you recommend in that situation?
I think what I hear the question as, which is an issue that we run into often, is that hiring teams are concerned by now adding on this initiative to increase diversity among the candidate pools, that automatically means that it's going to slow down the hiring process. Time to fill in the hiring process isn't slowed down by diversity recruiting. This is a workforce planning issue that's slowing.
Yes, if you're up front, if you're out ahead of it, it shouldn't be an issue.
Exactly. And this is something that I have to clarify as I'm talking with employers, that I want us to move away from blaming this on, focus on diversity recruiting. If you have a really strong, workforce planning team, right, that even when you're trying to figure out how many positions you need, also understanding where in your organization you're underrepresented, and over this amount of years, you're going to try to reach representation. If you know all of that stuff up front, and then all of the work that your recruiters and sourcers are doing to build these relationships and to, to figure out where strategically am I going to source and partner and recruit and all of that, that helps it in and of itself, and it won't slow down your process that way. So remember, it's not a diversity recruiting issue, is along the lines of workforce planning.
Great point. What advice do you have around sharing diversity data with all employees, especially when the numbers are dismal or the goals seem low?
I believe in vulnerability, right? And vulnerability means I'm going to share some things with you to help you to understand what's happening right now, no matter how ugly this may look. And in organizations, I found some organizations are more worried about the judgment or what people are going to think than how are we going to meet this goal. And I believe that one of the best ways of getting, enterprise-wide involvement is helping them to understand, here's what's happening at our company.
Yep.
And every company has a different story, but starting off that conversation with, here's our demo here, and it could be any type of, demographic information. Let's just say, here's our racial demographic information, or, maybe our gender demographic information. We understand through this that we have some room to grow to get to a good level of representation here. And connect it to the bottom line, right? Don't just give people the data and just say, here, I want you to look at it. Connect it to where you're trying to go with that data.
Yeah.
Why is it important to increase representation? Many leaders, the rabbit hole, many leaders have not, they are unsure themselves why increasing representation is important outside of a good faith effort, or how increased diversity actually adds to the bottom line. They know that it does. They know that statistically that it does this, but they're unsure with how. And so if they take some time to think about, all of that, answering those questions. So don't just show the data, put it in context to how it connects and where you're trying to go with representation. So if you do it in that way, I think that's fine.
Absolutely. I think great points. And I should tell everyone, we have about 10 more minutes and there's so many questions for you, but I didn't officially say, if you have questions for Jen, please put them in the Q&A function. I will try to take what I can. So someone asked, we are all living the virtual onboarding. What are some tips that you would share to help in the onboarding process to help make new hires feel welcomed and included?
I'm gonna share one of my favorite tips, and this is gonna make a lot of people uncomfortable, but I have to share this information because it is supportive. If you truly want to impact equity, or people feeling a level of equity as they're entering your organization, share the unwritten rules to success for working at your company. Now, let me unpack that for a second. Every organization is different. How to be successful at this organization is very different with this organization. At one company, it may mean that as long as you have the highest number in sales, it doesn't matter if you're snarky and mean and nasty to everybody else around you, because success to that company means having the highest number in sales. To this other organization, it could mean that success means you have to know the right people. You have to enter the right networks. And so it doesn't matter how high performing you are. Because if those in the right network do not know you or your work, which is two very different things, they have to know both. If they don't know you or your work, then you're not going to get to that next level. But these aren't things that organizations acknowledge generally, because organizations are still within an ideal, that an ideal is that, oh, to get to the next level here, you work hard, you go through your, your performance review, you get a good star rating, or we open a position, you apply for it, you're vetted fairly, but that's not what's happening behind the scenes. So the reason why this is sort of controversial is because in order to provide the unwritten rules to new hires coming in, organizations have to
Admit.
acknowledge. Yes, yes, yes. They have to admit and acknowledge that this is what success looks like here. And then you write it down and you give it to people coming in. That, to me, if you want to create equity in onboarding, give new hires the unwritten rules to success at your company.
I love that. And I think consistent in your last two answers is, at this moment, it's essential every company realize transparency is rewarded, authenticity is rewarded. And if you try to sweep this stuff under the rug, it's never going to work out. If you try to kind of hide the bad news, it doesn't ever end well.
Because and what happens is, because I see it on the job seeker side, they feel it. They may not be able to articulate what's happening. They may not be able to pinpoint, exactly what it is, but they feel it. And when I'm able to come in and give people words for what they're experiencing, they're like, yes, that is what's happening. And at the end of the day, it creates that feeling by itself is enough to make a person not feel safe, even if it's like psychological safety. It's enough to make that person feel gaslighted. It's enough to make that person want to leave. And that's why, again, as a part of our trainings, when we're talking to hiring managers, we spend a whole module talking about retention. Even though we're talking about recruiting, retention is key, because if people are leaving as quickly as they're coming, you cannot increase diversity overall.
Absolutely. And again, the authentic experiences of employees are going to matter in many, many ways. So another question is, Black Lives Matter is a hot topic at the moment. And how do you coach hiring managers, leaders to address questions about it when they come up from candidates?
So I'm not a huge fan of giving hiring managers talking points. When someone brings this up, say this, this, and this in return. I would want all of the hiring managers to understand the history of how we got here. That's really, history is such a powerful teacher, right? So all of us hiring managers, I want them to understand the history of how we got here, and why this is so important, not just to Black communities and Black populations, but why it's so important in general. Because I think in that understanding, you won't necessarily need talking points, although you need to understand what the organization stance is on it, but you don't necessarily need talking points, but that manager can speak more vulnerably and authentically when they're talking to that person. So again, it goes back to this idea of, do your managers feel qualified to talk about these things? And most of them don't feel qualified. Do they feel comfortable and confident that they can speak to these things? You have to address those things first, and then the conversations will be easier.
So again, training and education about the historical context. And just to reiterate, Jen does consulting on this very topic. She does training. So I want to make sure everyone knows that. So we talked about this challenge of the confidence bias, the confidence gap with women, right? And so part of it, and I spent a lot of time doing this, helping women find more confidence. Is there anything that the hiring managers can do to reduce bias when they aren't perceiving as much confidence?
You can actually ask a question, and this could be a good question. how confident do you feel in your, let me step back. Now that you know the duties of this position, because you've looked at the job description and da, 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 how confident do you feel that you can get this job done on a scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest? And now you're inviting that person to say, oh, I would probably say I'm about 8, 9, 10% confident that they can get that job done. So inviting them through, asking that question, or asking, what part of this job do you feel most confident that you can do? Because some people, like even women, because we're talking about women right now, some women may say, oh, Jen, I feel 100% confident that I can do these 5 things, but it's that one thing right there I'm not that quite sure of, which goes back to what Sheryl Sandberg was talking about in her book, Lean In, that we look at all the qualifications, we want to meet all of them. And I'm telling job seekers all the time, you don't even know how important that one qualification is. Those 4 or 5 things that you know how to do. So now asking that question, which of these qualifications do you feel most confident that you can do? And maybe even the least confident as well. I think that will help to guide.
That's a great question. And it's funny, I've sort of realized it myself as I create job descriptions for my own hiring, that it's a wish list. It's not like I will only hire someone who does every single thing on this list or has done it before, right? At least this is my wish list. And I think often we expect that we have to meet all these qualifications when really meeting half of them is enough.
Can I tell you a secret that I share with job seekers?
Yeah.
So everyone on here, we're going to keep it a secret. Okay. So I'll say to people on their job search, if you look at a job description and if it has a ton of qualifications, it's a red flag for one of 2 things. One, it's either they're not sure what they're looking for. Mm-hmm. And if the manager is not sure what they're looking for, you're going to get caught up in all of that. You don't want to get caught up because they're going to use these interviews to figure out what they do and don't want. Or 2, they've added so many qualifications because the person who left the position or who was terminated from the position was so terrible that they want to ensure that nobody else comes in without meeting all those qualifications. Then again, job seeker, you're going to get caught up in that too. You don't want to get caught up in that either, because now that manager is scared to pull the trigger on who they want to hire.
Yeah.
But either way, I look at both of those as a red flag, and you can tell when you see loads of qualifications, or if you don't see them broken out between, your basic versus your preferred or your desired qualifications.
Yeah, you're not set up for success. You're never going to be set up for success in that role. All right, 1 minute to go. One last question, because I think it's a great question. We saw a lot of companies adding a function where somebody is the diversity recruiter and their job is to build the pipelines of diverse candidates. What is your view, and this is for a very large company, between taking that approach versus integrating diversity into the entire major operation, the whole kind of mothership?
Now, this is so funny personally, because I just had this conversation yesterday, and I think she's the same person that just asked this question. And here's what I say. Now, many organizations will say, I want to start us off with having a diversity recruiter to do this work. And that diversity recruiter is going to, they're responsible for increasing diversity in the candidate pool. My philosophy is different. I believe if we're ever going to get to a point of moving away from diversity recruiting to just recruiting, every recruiter must see diversity recruiting as their accountability. Every recruiter. And the only way that a recruiter is going to see that where they're accountable for it is if it's embedded in every recruiter's role and position. It's hard to do that if one person is held accountable on the performance review around it. That's just my perspective. Though I don't judge organizations who say we want to start off with a diversity recruiter or a diversity sourcer. We all start somewhere. And if that's where we're going to start here, that's fine.
Yeah, great. Jen, this has been incredible. A lot of people asking, was this recorded? Yes, you'll all get the recording. You'll all get the data. Fairy Godboss is the largest career community for women. We'd love to talk to all of you about your strategies to increase the volume of women applicants to your candidate pool. Jen Tardy runs Jen Tardy Consulting. Obviously, you can see she is a tour de force, and you should definitely talk to her about how you can increase diversity in your recruiting process. Thank you all for being with us today. Bye.